Hi and welcome to AXSchat. Delighted that we've got Heydon Pickering with us today. Heydon is a well-known figure in the accessibility world and has written a book called Inclusive Design Patterns, which is published by Smashing Magazine, and I'm partway through reading it. It's good so far. But I've been following Heydon on Twitter for a long time for his little nuggets of wisdom. So welcome, Heydon. It's delightful to have you here.
Hi Neil. Hello Antonio. Hello Debra.
Hi, Heydon. Welcome.
So tell me, what was it that got you into accessibility in the first place?
That's a good question. So I started learning about web standards, I suppose you could call it, which is a sort of, I think for a lot of people is a precursor to getting into sort of full-on hardcore accessibility. In about 2006 or 2007, and I was working for a book wholesaler who did some websites for some British newspapers like The Guardian and The Telegraph, and so I was doing the front ends there, and I was learning about how, you know, just like basic principles, like you should put links into lists and things like that. But I guess although they had implications in terms of UX for people with disabilities or people who are using assistive technologies, I suppose it was, to start with, it was just an exercise in, I want to do a good job. Like I want to write the code well and feel good about actually producing something which wasn't in some way defunct or obsolete. And then the more I sort of dug into that world, I discovered there was little which was correct in coding, which actually necessarily had an impact on users. And so I got interested in accessibility there. But then the real sort of from a personal point of view, I developed some mental health issues around that time. And because I had those, and because when I talk to people about them, when I talk to them about anxiety and depression, they tended to look at me like I was showing a card trick to a dog, like they just not really get it. I began to appreciate what it was like for some people seeing stuff that I designed and just going, I can't use this. And instead of my reaction then being, well, why can't you use it? I can use it. It became, okay, I think I understand that. I understand where there can be a real disconnection. I suppose in America, you'd call it a disconnect, right?
Yeah.
A disconnection between what I think is going to work for people and what isn't, or what I think people are going to understand and what people wouldn't. So I think it was having mental health issues, which people didn't really get, that I then realized that that could transfer onto physical disabilities, but just generally generally had it was like an analogy for people just differing in the way that they use things and the way that they see things. So that's kind of from those two angles, really, from the technical point of view and then the sort of personal point of view as well. And also I get migraines, and I always say to people, if you get a migraine and then you have the blind spot where you're temporarily blind, and of course it's in no way comparable to having permanent sight issue, suddenly I have to start sort of doing things completely differently, or I have to give up or whatever. And I can sort of, there's a little element of just appreciating that some things can go wrong, and that can have an impact, even if it's a temporary one. And that's one thing that I'm really interested in, is there being temporary circumstances that you can go through where you might not be able to use things in the same way. Like if I break my arm, I might not be able to use a mouse, that kind of thing. So yeah, something like that.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I know that when we've talked before, you've also talked about interface blindness. Now, this is something that you and I both, I would say, suffer from, but deal with.
Yeah.
I can visit I can find my way around an application, but I come back to it the next day, I won't remember how I've used it. I will have to pretty much start again from scratch a lot of the time. So I guess for me, one of the passions driving my sort of usability head, rather than the sort of, and it's a crossover between usability and cognitive accessibility, is making stuff easy and obvious, because you know, sort of blethering around, blundering around an interface is hard work, and it takes time, and so. And of course, it's frustrating, and you don't want to go through life frustrated, or for your users to be either.
No, I'm easily slighted, and I find it offensive because if you see a complex interface, you're seeing an interface which someone hasn't put work into, or has not said no when someone has said, let's just add this other feature and completely dilute the whole purpose of this thing or whatever. But yeah, like with just things like parking meters, my brain just stops. I've got no, I guess it's technically it's kind of like a low executive functioning. So if I'm presented with a lot of information at once, I just sort of go a bit cataleptic and just, I don't know where to start, I guess. And parking meters is a classic one. My wife and I will be at a parking meter and she'll realize, oh, there's no point asking Heydon to try and like work out what buttons to press in what order, because it's, so she sort of has to guide me. And and I mean, parking meters are fairly complex in Britain, I suppose. But I think I think like yourself, Neil, I have an unusually hard time with them. And so yeah, I often say to people, I'm in the business of making interfaces because I'm not good at interfaces, rather than the other way around. Because I'm bad at interfaces, that's why I want to make some, because then at least there might be some which are simple enough for me to use. It helps that I make them, obviously, because then I know what my decision making was. They might be terrible for other people, but yeah.
Okay, I see Debra's got a question.
Yes, Heydon, I think that's such an interesting point that you brought up. I have been married 34 years, and often that's the kind of relationship I have with my husband. And so sometimes I think we know for sure that women's brains work differently from men's brains, but also depending upon how our brain works. I mean, Neil has been a real eye-opener for me, because Neil has come out about his dyslexia and really had the courage to talk about how something that many people would perceive as a weakness has actually become his super strength. And so I think it's so fascinating, all this stuff. And I believe the easier we make something, because it's funny you should bring up parking meters, because they are so complicated. Even figuring out where I'm allowed to park and not park, it can be very confusing. I will say to my son when I go to downtown Richmond, that sign saying, can I park here or can't I park here? So for some reason, we make things very, very complicated. And so I like that you're taking it from a perspective that there is value for everyone, because of course, isn't that when we have the greatest wins, is when we design something that everybody can use. And so anyway, so my question is, I'd like to know, I'm also an author, and so I'd like to know more about your book and why you decided to write it. Why did you think, because as somebody that has birthed a few books, and it's so much harder than it seems.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so much more hard than I always expected to be. I always think it's going to publish in a month and it takes 2 years, but I would be curious to know why you did it, what the book's about, and why did you think the world needs it?
So there's a funny credence to that book, because a while back I wrote another book which was also for Smashing Magazine, called Apps for All, and it was specifically about writing the HTML and I suppose the way ARIA stuff as well, to so that it was specifically screen reader and keyboard accessible, I suppose, more than anything else. It didn't really cover touch interfaces or UX, broadly speaking, so much. It was more the technical approach to it, although naturally it was about trying to create an experience which was usable for assistive technology users and keyboard users. And it was quite well received. It wasn't publicized an awful lot. It was only an ebook as part of their ebook library, rather than being printed as well, which I was happy with. That's okay. And it wasn't very long either. But the weird thing was that it was a year later, or about a year later, Vitaly, who's Mr. Smashing Magazine, he contacted me and went, "Heydon, your book's really good." And I thought, why are you telling me this now? And of course, Smashing Magazine is a big team, but he was just getting around to reading it later, I think, just because they were having a revamp or something. And they wanted to make sure that as they were redesigning, they built in some accessibility as part of that process. So good on them. And he sat down and read it and discovered that he really, really liked it. So he said, well, why not? Let's re-release it, but let's do a sort of a bumper edition, and then make a bigger deal of it and have a printed version. And I said no. I didn't want to revamp it or redo it, because I didn't like the format so much. I mean, I'm proud of that book, but I wanted it to be about, I wanted it to be broader, and I wanted it to be more inclusive, which is obviously how it came to be, inclusive design patterns. But yeah, I didn't want to rewrite that book, because I didn't want people to think of accessibility as just, you know, writing the right attributes on the right HTML elements. It's so in the new book, it covers things to do with writing style as much as anything else, performance as well, because if you've got lots of code which is getting blocked and it's not rendering on someone's browser because they're on a bad network, then that's no good. And also, you can save people money if they've got a small data contract and it's more performant, then it's inclusive of people who are perhaps on a budget, that kind of thing. So I tried to make it as broad as possible, although it does talk about screen reader and keyboard accessibility quite a lot, just because it gets into the nitty-gritty of writing code, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. But the reason it's patterns is because I started trying to write it by principle, as in talk about, say, making it accessible in a non-visual paradigm. So for assistive technology users, screen reader users, etc., and do like a chapter on that, and then do a chapter on writing and clarity in writing, and then do a chapter on like keyboard and touch, like the interaction chapter. And that was a nightmare to write it like that. And I wrote like a couple of chapters and I was just not happy with it. And the reason was that it just wasn't compatible with the way that I work, which is to think of things in terms of them being inclusive things. So you don't write a screen reader compatible piece of design. You try and make it a piece of design which works for as many people as possible. So going back to what you were saying about just trying to bring in everyone. So the task became picking sort of common patterns that we use, like navigation blocks or filter widgets or login forms or whatever, and just meditating on how many different ways I could improve this in terms of how many more people would be able to use it. And so that became the book. And that's beginning to inform the way that I actually do accessibility audits as well, because most accessibility audits, or all the ones I've worked on, are based on principles. So it sort of follows WCAG. And so it would be like, make sure that it works with a keyboard. And so you test it for that and then make sure it does this. But then when you end up giving advice to development teams, you end up sort of telling them about the different faults for something completely separately. And the problem with that is that it's so tedious then to get it to work, because you'll fix it for a screen reader and then you have to go back and go, well, actually, I didn't fix it for keyboard. Or if you're doing those two things separately, then you're not doing them in the most efficient way. So the example I always come back to is the button, as in the button element. Now you can take a div and you can make it keyboard accessible by putting a tab index attribute on it, and then you can make it screen reader accessible by putting a button roll on it, and then you can make it translatable by using a correct text node or whatever. But instead of doing all of that, you kind of just want to just use the right element for the job, and then that's an inclusive thing in its own right. And it's already like preformed. You don't actually have to do any design, it's designed for you. So yeah, that's why it was a pattern-based thing. And I just think that development teams and developers are much more comfortable in dealing with gadgets or widgets that they've made and just making them as good as they can be, rather than doing like, here's where there's some missing alt text, here's another bit where there's some missing alt text, here's another bit where there's some missing alt text, etc., and just going through a whole interface, doing that in a sort of piecemeal way. So yeah, that's how it came about like that. Unfortunately, Vitaly said okay and gave me a chance to do this what was turned out to be a completely different book, really, based on what was what would have just been kind of a re-release of the other one, and a lot more work for me, but
Right.
but work that I enjoy, because as hard as it is, and I agree, writing is hard, it comes much more naturally to me than coding. So actually, I'm more comfortable sitting there, you know, writing Markdown or writing a document than I am trying to work out, you know, how to chain a JavaScript promise or something. So if I've got a few months to write something, I'm actually quite comfortable with it. So that's good.
Well, and I think it's really important that authors like you write about this, because I remember about 6 months ago, I trained a very large corporation in the United States about 508 and WCAG and all that stuff. And it was a technical class, multiple days, developers, content writers, programmers, things like that. And what was interesting, really comforting to me, was that they already knew it. Some of them knew more about it than I did. Some of them knew actually more about really digging into ARIA code and things like that. And so I said, well, okay, so y'all know how to do it. You're very innovative, very creative. Why aren't you doing it? And they said, well, the reality is that we're not doing it because this big multinational corporation has never asked us to do it. And they're asking us to do 15 billion other things that we barely can do. And so we've actually been criticized at times by management when we're trying to do it. And they're like, did we ask you to do that? So I think it's so important that the voices come from people like you and Neil and Antonio. It's interesting. I've been a programmer for years, but I'm sort of looking at this in a very higher way now, as opposed to really digging into the widgets. And I'm not as strong at actually training. I would never try to train people like any of the three of you to do this. I know enough to be dangerous, but I think the more we expand the conversations really to people like you and Neil and Antonio that really understand the widgets and all the different moving parts, and the better we're going to be as a society. So I'm going to turn it over to Antonio, because I know he has a question too.
Thank you, Debra. Just a few weeks ago, my daughter was saying, "Oh, Daddy, when you are at home, it's much easier when we need to deal with technology. So, you know, things are sorted out faster." And and with so many devices coming to the home, and a fridge connected to the web, devices, IoT at home, sensors, all that. How do you see that in that the home, and when someone is designing products to be used inside the house, how can those products somehow progress with the needs of the user? Because the people, we are getting older. There are people from different generations inside the house, and all these devices, they seem to speak a different language. So what do you think? It's because it's a challenge, and sometimes people realize, oh, somebody's not using a device. Somebody bought a device and used it for a few months, and then they leave the device behind, and they don't really take advantage of it because they lose the patience to how it operates. So, what's your take in the fact that we are talking about Internet of Things, bringing all these devices to the home? How can we make them better and somehow invisible for the user?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm really ambivalent about the so-called Internet of Things, because in general, I see very little utility in my fridge having a web browser. Doesn't really interest me. I think I saw one coming out the other day, which was an actual candle which you could turn on and off with your iPhone, which seems more complicated to me. Yeah, well, I think it had like a lighter inside, and then it was powered that way. And I think a lot of the time we're over-engineering things, and I think we're in danger of, and it's the same with web interfaces. When you work with professional developers like developing things, and because they like developing things, they'll develop things even if they're not needed. And then it's up to a marketing department to then go, well, how are we going to sell this? And they'll find a way. But I guess I'm not sort of I'm not sort of I'm not easily persuaded, but it's a reinvention of things which really bothers me. I used to have a car which was a Renault Megane, and it had a key, but the key was like a card. So the idea was that you'd have a card that you put in your wallet instead of using an actual key, like a metal key with a serrated edge. And because of the technology in this card, and because it being an older car, so they hadn't been able to get it that small, it was, first of all, a card which did not fit in your wallet. So they'd sort of fallen down on that premise. But then they'd overcomplicated the whole process of driving this car. So you'd have to get in and sit down, and you put the card in a slot, and then you had a separate ignition button that you had to press. And then I think the ignition button took care of the locking the car as well, or something. I can't remember. But then you were in this sort of absurd situation where you'd stop the car, and you could get out of the car, and just forget that the ignition was, that the engine was still running. So then they had an auxiliary thing inside it where it would start beeping at you and warning you that you'd left the car without the key card out of the slot, sort of thing, and without turning the engine off. So they'd taken something which was really simple, and there's such a beautiful thing about a key, in that you put the key into the slot and then turn it, and that both starts the engine and it ensures that the key is locked into place, you know. And then when you want to leave and you want to lock the car, the only way you can do that is by taking the key out of position and doing that. It's much simpler, it's much smaller as well. And then for whatever reason, they've decided to change that and over-engineer it. And from my point of view, and I'm sure Neil could probably appreciate this as well, when people take something which is simple and make it complicated for the sake of, you know, making it a gimmick or something, it makes our lives more difficult, because you've then got it no longer belongs to a convention, a perfectly good convention. You've got to relearn how these things work. And so, yeah, so relearning how my house works for me, Antonio, is just a nightmare scenario. The idea that I've got to remember which app it is on my phone which unlocks my front door. And surely just the added complexity of that is bound to have implications for people with disabilities, or just, you know, physical disabilities or cognitive disabilities, because everything is just simply more complex. And I always keep coming back to that all the time, that the simpler things are and the more expected things are, the easier they are and the more inclusive they are. So I guess to answer the question is, I would hope as little as possible was turned into an Internet of Thingsy, gadgety version of something else. But with the kind of side note, or the exception that sometimes some wonderful things are created where technology is used to make the lives of people a lot easier who perhaps struggle or perhaps need a bit of assistance. I'm trying to think of a good example now. One of you may be able to come up with one, but going back a long time, like for deaf people, the phone which actually lights up, that kind of idea, things like that, where you're innovating things so that they're more inclusive, so that in those cases you're adding complexity in order to meet certain people's needs. But I think generally, the more complex things are, the more exclusive they are, and the fewer people will be able to learn and use them. So yeah, best avoided on the whole.
So I'm with you on Bluetooth light bulbs, you know, iPhone unlock front doors.
Yeah.
You know, what a double whammy that is. You know, you lose your iPhone and then you lock yourself out of your house as well, to boot.
Yeah, well, did you see that news story recently where someone
run out of battery? Antonio saying.
Sorry.
Antonio saying you run out of battery and you're locked out of the house.
You're right.
And your charger's inside, and you've only got, you know, $100, and that's not enough to buy a new Apple Sync cable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
because they've been courageous and they've changed the cable format again.
Yeah, and. I don't know how true this is, but there was another story, which was a more extreme example of this, which is where apparently someone was phoning someone up and said, "I'm at your house. I need to pick something up. Can you let me in?" And they went, "Oh, I'm not at home." and they said, "Oh, don't worry, Siri let me in," and they just opened the door because they knew that they had that system. Or I don't think it was Siri let me in, but it was something like that where they had that system, and they just knew what they had to say to it because they'd been near them when they'd said it or something, because they're friends.
Wow.
And fortunately, it was a friend, not a stranger, just like eavesdropping. Now, I don't know if that might be an apocryphal tale or whatever, but you can foresee issues like that. Added complexity necessarily means added fragility, and just the chances of things going wrong, become more possible and more frequent, I think. Yeah.
So we talked about complexity, and yet what I see often is actually complexity masquerading as simplicity, which is where you basically take away all of the user interface and hide it behind a massive screen.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what do I do? Do I swipe up? Do I swipe down? Do I wipe my nose on it? Well, what am I going to do? And you changed it since yesterday.
They call it discoverable.
And I use sort of these things all the time, but I sit there and I watch my wife quietly, well, not quietly seething, absolutely, really, and I think, well, if that's happening to my wife, who's fairly technology literate, imagine what happens to people when they've accidentally turned automatic updates on, and someone's, you go out, and it's happened to me. It's like you go out and you come back and someone's rearranged all of the furniture in your house.
Yeah. Oh, that's the worst. It's like the supermarket effect, isn't it? Where you go to your local supermarket, you know where to go to get your coffee or whatever it is you're going in for, and then they decide to rearrange all of the aisles because they kind of want to confuse you so that you discover more of what's there. And I don't like being manipulated like that, because the thing is, even though I'm a designer and I'm an interface designer, as you can probably imagine, I'm not really that into interfaces. I kind of hate interfaces and I want to use them as little as possible. And I think in a way that's an advantage for me, because then I'm kind of more similar to your average user. I mean, there's no such thing as an average user, so perhaps that's the wrong term, but I think designers really like using interfaces, and they like showing off interfaces, and they like to push interfaces to their limits. Whereas users just want to get stuff done so that they're finished and they can, go to the pub or go to sleep or whatever. And so, yeah, that whole, explore our interface, discover all of the complexity on your own times. I have no time for that at all. Just give me a hyperlink I can click or a button that I can press and just have done with it. Yeah.
Because when you give the users what they want, they give you more attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And playing mind games with them is never gonna. I mean, some people may be like that, but if you're into gaming, maybe. But I'm not like that at all.
So I think that's it's a really significant issue that we face right now, and it's a real issue for cognitive accessibility for the older generations and everything else. So and we've got these design patterns that have been around for a fairly long time now. Flat design, which is really hard to discern what's a button, what's not. They've been fairly persistent, unfortunately persistent.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for the next new thing, please invent black again. Because I think it's a significant problem, and if we're trying to bring the cohorts of society that are not yet connected and that really need to be connected, we've got to make it simple and we've got to make it attractive, but at the same time recognize that a lot of companies have to make money and they need to refresh their products and find ways of generating revenue. How do you think we can strike that balance?
I'm a firm believer that if things are genuinely simple and straightforward and obvious, that they will be more popular. And I think it's it's our design culture, our kind of broken, dysfunctional design culture, which leads us to make things which are overly complex and overly sort of obsolete, I guess. So I think there's a case to be made that simple things just are popular. But if someone is given something complex, but it does something that they really want it to do, like I can't use Facebook. I don't understand that interface at all. I mean, I can sort of get by and do a few tasks, but I don't really understand it. I think they don't have to try, do they, to make it better? I mean, I'm sure they do their best, but there's no. If they made it really simple, a lot more people would be able to use it better. But they've kind of got the market stitched up anyway, so there's no incentive. So I think a lot of the innovation is going to come from is going to always come from the underdog, and say, well, we need to get people on board really quickly. We have to keep it simple so that people can adopt it and understand it really quickly and really get into it. And so hopefully that means that's going to drive a bit of a revolution. And I think it's really funny that a lot of people talk about in terms of performance as well, because if you keep something simple, then you make it performant too. Because there's less code for the interface, and there's less code which executes, there's less code to actually sends to the client or whatever. I've come up with this idea called progressive non-enhancement, which is where you take just like basic sort of structure of a page, which people can just use easily by scrolling up and down, and then you don't turn it into a carousel or some sort of fancy widget where things fly around in 3D or whatever. But yeah, I think it's I think if there's a balance that needs to be struck somewhere, it's being able to placate people who just like technology, technophiles, who want to make things which are innovative in the does something different way. But at the same time encourage that culture to foster ideas where actually it might be interesting to make something which is pared down, or it might be interesting, or it might be a challenge to make something which is accessible. And that's ultimately that, you know, that's part of why I've stuck to doing accessibility and to doing inclusive design for such a long time, is because it is an interesting challenge. And I wish I could get people to see that challenge rather than the let's make something all discoverable and alien sort of challenge. I don't know if that really answers the question very well, but that's...
Heydon, before you leave that, will you repeat what you just said? Because I think it's very important, and I did not get it. So you said you were not doing accessibility and instead encouraging inclusive design. Did I hear that right?
Well,
I mean, just help me understand it. Yeah, help me understand where you're going with that, because I think it's really important.
Okay, so I was saying that I wanted to encourage, sort of demonstrate to people that there's an interesting challenge in doing accessibility or inclusive design. But what I think you thought I was saying is also an interesting point. I think that the differences between what I would call accessibility and what I would call inclusive design are kind of subtle, but I think inclusive design perhaps encompasses more than disability. But I think the importance is that you focus on things which people can't help first. So in inclusive design, it would cover things like performance, poor networks, people in different circumstances who might not actually have a physical or cognitive disability, but simply are being excluded because of where they are or because of what language they speak or whatever. But you have to start, I think, with things which people can't help in any circumstance. So disability is, you know, something that you have to, is an important thing to cater for first of all. But there's another sort of dimension to that, which is that I think a lot of the time when people talk about accessibility, they mean accessibility compliance, and accessibility compliance does not by any stretch of the imagination map 100% to actual accessibility or actual usability to different people. So you can make a 100% WCAG 508 compliant website, which first of all, no one using assistive technologies can use, and possibly no one else either. So one of the things that I tend to say often is an unusable website is necessarily inaccessible, I guess is one way of putting it. Yeah. So yeah, inclusive design, I tend to use just because it's broader, but yeah, I do worry also that the term accessibility is beleaguered because it's associated with compliance and box checking too, and it doesn't have the word design in it. And I really wish people thought about accessibility as a design problem more, rather than a technical, you know, let's just make sure that this has alt text on this image, whether or not it needs it kind of thing. Yeah.
Right.
I hope that answers what you meant.
No, that was excellent. That was an excellent. And I totally agree with you too. I think we all agree with you, but thank you for digging into that. Neil?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think that quite often I see stuff that's been made accessible, and we've as an industry given accessibility a bad name amongst designers, and when we need that rapprochement to really say, actually, no, you can make beautiful stuff that works for everyone, that is accessible, and that's inclusive design. You know, you've thought about it, you've understood the issues and the problems, and by the way, it happens to work. It happens to be keyboard accessible, and it works with screen, etc. So that's just good. That's not going through the motions. That's actually applying good design thinking to something, and I think that's really important.
I'm glad you said design thinking, because I think that the industry gets design wrong anyway. And in the beginning of the Inclusive Designs book, I talk about this problem where we think of design as a visual thing when it's really a problem-solving domain. And that's been sort of repeated as a mantra over and over again, but I still don't think we quite get it.
No.
We've not quite embraced it. So making something accessible that's a design problem, right? Like anything else. And so I break it right down to being designing is thinking and developing is doing. So that dichotomy of design being like a department or a set of people, and then development being another department of more technical people who have more scientific brains or whatever, it's complete rubbish. Designing is thinking, developing is doing. And if you can't do either of those, or you can't do both at the same time, then you're not awake, basically. So everyone is a designer and a doer, a designer and a developer. And we have to start thinking of design as not being the look and feel or the visual impact or the delight or whatever. It's how things work, isn't it? It's being successful in terms of interaction. Yeah.
It's the totality of the thing. It's not just the experience. It's the whole process of how you use something, and some of the most frustrating sites I've ever and products I've ever used are some of the best looking.
Yes, yeah, that's a trend, definitely a trend. Yeah.
But equally, some of the most accessible have been some of the worst looking. So we need to find that happy medium. So I think we're pretty much at the end of the half hour now. So thank you very much, Heydon. It's been
no worries. It was great.
I will look forward to chatting with you tomorrow night on Twitter.
Yeah, and me. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.
Cheers, Anthony.
Excellent conversation. Excellent conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you.